So I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Miss Van Walraven.
Hello and welcome to my Masterworks presentation. My name is Julia Van Walraven, and for the duration of 6 months, I studied genocide. So now I would like to ask everyone, what is genocide? What comes to mind when you hear this word? Well, when I hear the word genocide, I think of death, destruction, and family, my family. I had and still have family that survived the persecution of Jews during World War II. My Oma was in hiding for about 13 months. She was hidden in plain sight, which means she was placed in a different town and she pretended to not have Jewish blood. She did not see her father, my great-grandfather, for 3 years. My great-grandmother, on my mother's side, was part of the Lakota tribe in North Dakota. My grandpa experienced discrimination directed towards Indigenous people in Saskatchewan, Canada. Studies show that the effect of trauma is predominantly present in every third generation. It is shown through mental illness, depression, guilt, and shame. I am often really hard on myself when it comes to marks and tasks. I am often told by my parents to stop belittling myself. I believe I push myself because I feel like I want to do good, and I want to do good where my ancestors didn't have the chance. I have lost many family members to this, so that is why I wanted to know what are the causes and effects of genocide. Genocide is a violent assault that attempts to obliterate, massacre, annihilate, and destroy a group of people. This definition has been compiled by the opinions of 3 different people. The first question I asked the people I interviewed was, what in your own words is the definition of genocide? It is a very difficult question to ask because the answers can be very varied. It is completely dependent on a person's views, opinions, and experiences. During this project, I interviewed 3 people, my Oma, Michael, and Rudy Kovanik. I did receive many varied answers. I can in fact make multiple definitions, but they would all almost include one thing, death. Genocide is mostly centered around the want to oppress and eventually rid the world of a racial, religious, or other group. The word genocide is derived from 2 words, GENOS, which means race, and CIDE. CIDE is a modern interpretation of the Latin word CAEDERE. It means to cut or to kill. CIDE is a combining form that follows words like homicide, incesticide, or pesticide. All these words have CIDE in them, and they all have something to do with extermination, destruction, death, annihilation, and purposeful killing. The word genocide fits into this category because the literal meaning is race and side, genocide. Up until 1944, the word genocide did not exist. It was created by a Polish international law scholar, Raphael Lemkin. He coined the word because the namelessness of the crime seemed to refer to it as a regular old massacre, instead of one that is an attempt to wipe out an entire group. Genocides happened before 1944, but there was no name for it. Winston Churchill called genocide a crime that has no name. It is important to have a word for a crime because if the act or person is nameless or wrongly named, it perhaps shows that the act or person is of unimportance. A very good example would be the misnaming of North American indigenous peoples. When Columbus landed in the Americas, he thought he had found India, so he called the people Indians. In the United States, this is still the term used to describe people who are definitely not Indian. This misjudgment, however, could suggest that we do not view the subject as unimportant because we lack even the energy to change how we refer to Indigenous peoples. A lot of Canadians would say we're better. We use the word First Nation, but the first term I heard when I was younger was the word Indian, and I heard this at school. This behavior towards the word is probably similar to how genocide was referenced to before the word was coined. When I was researching the causes of genocide, I found a step-by-step explanation of the stages. There are 8. The first stage is classification. This is when a group of people, racial, religious, or other, are separated from government or society. An example would be the general separation of Jewish people from German people, and eventually the majority of Europe. Another example would be the classification of indigenous peoples as being the lower, weaker, and uncivilized race by European colonialists. The second step is symbolization. This is when a government or civilian leader unites the group together so the dislike and uneasiness for them can grow, and so that they become more intimidated. An example would be the demand to sew the Star of David onto the coats of Jewish people. The third step is dehumanization. The oppressors treat the oppressed group as inhumane or equal to vermin that need to be taken care of. An example would be the banning of Jews and indigenous peoples from going to certain places and doing certain things, such as having a shopping curfew, or they were forbidden from using places such as beaches, tennis courts, and riding clubs, and they were banned from marrying someone outside their group. The fourth step is organization. The leader of the oppressors creates a large army or group of regular people who support their cause. The army or citizens are willing to attempt to murder anyone based on ethnicity. You are either a supporter of the oppressed or a supporter of the oppressors. The fifth step is polarization. Threatening messages and propaganda is broadcast throughout a nation to bring the oppressed group into the spotlight, so the oppressors can focus more hate and intimidation onto the group, such as radio broadcasts banning religious practices and the destruction of sacred places of worship and meaning. An example would be the burning of synagogues in Germany. The sixth step is preparation. This is when the members of the oppressed group are recorded and rounded up to prepare them for the next stage, which is extermination. An example would be when Jews were already there or on their way to a death camp. Another example would be the ultimatum the indigenous peoples were given: go onto reserve and receive food, or live off the reserve and starve. The seventh step, extermination, is when the killing of the oppressed group commences. The group can be killed through poison, warfare, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The killing of the group is often easier for the oppressors because they believe that the group is unequal and has the status of vermin. The children of the oppressors are often conditioned to think that the acts of their family or friends are necessary and ethically right. The eighth and final step is denial. The rest of the world is often horrified or disturbed by the acts of the oppressors if they become known. So, the perpetrators deny they committed a crime or horrible act because they believed it was for the greater good of their colony or nation. They do not see the criminality of their actions until a much later point when they eventually confess and repay damages. But sometimes the repayment never happens and the nation remains oblivious to their actions. The causes of genocide are still widely discussed between many scholars, professors, historians, and hopefully regular people. I believe genocide is no singular cause. The lead-up and polarization can be caused by multiple things. I received a wide range of answers from my interviews. It can be fear-based, either racial or religious intolerance, political and territorial greed, philosophical differences, or jealousy. These factors can all be seen as causes of genocide, but is there a recurring theme in every genocide? In many genocides, there is a want for more land, which can also be seen as greed if the land is not needed, but rather desired. Many genocides are thought to be of religious origin. The Old Testament has a line that says, "But thou shalt utterly destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you." It is not known if this was an actual biblical event or if the text was acted upon, but it is still a prejudice towards a Jewish group of people. Since the birth of Judaism, Jews have been the victims of mass slaughter, ethnic cleansing, persecution, and murder. I believe this event, as described in the Old Testament, could have very well happened. The 20th century and onward was particularly horrible. The deaths caused by genocide are believed to be at around 30 million. Some of the genocides were very sudden, and most of the time they passed very quickly. Genocides are often quick and bloody, the Holocaust being an exception. An example of a quick and bloody genocide would be the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, starting in April and ending in June, there were upwards of 800,000 people murdered. The minority of the people were Tutsis. This genocide was 100 days long. A recurring theme in the Rwandan genocide, the Holocaust, and North American colonialism would be the prejudice created usually by a small group of people. In the beginning, the Nazis were not a very large group, but they had very smart and influential thought leaders. Hitler was a leader, and he knew how to speak to a large crowd very well. He was a powerful and spellbinding speaker. In fact, I have heard from a couple of people that Hitler could have been an admired and respected leader if he hadn't have killed millions of people. He pulled Germany out of their depression after World War I and made them proud to be German again. In a sense, he nationalized the people. Since Hitler helped the German people feel proud and confident, once again, they trusted his word and radical ideas. The German people essentially followed him down the rabbit hole and ended up in a war yet again. The Holocaust began when the people's trust was placed in Hitler, and when the years of anti-Semitism finally reached a breaking point. Now that I've talked a little bit about the causes, I would like to explain the values of European colonialists. Most of the Caucasian immigrants that came to Canada were generally treated better than Africans, Asians, and other non-whites. Many of them were not exactly ethical people. They did not possess many good values towards anybody that was strange or different than them. They often left Europe seeking a better life. They often struggled back home. The majority of them were peasants or middle class. The gold rush was a time of great immigration because the poor were seeking the prospect of gold and money. The poverty and struggle back home hardened them, and it often made them cold and extremely greedy. They often concentrated on survival. They did not really care if anyone around them was harmed. They were looking out for themselves and possibly family. They took what they could and did not consider or really value the lives of Indigenous people. So, what happens when you experience a genocide? You can be affected in many different ways: anger, depression, substance abuse, suicidal tendencies, confusion. All these things are part of a typical case of psychological trauma. Trauma affects you and the people around you. If the victim has young children, their behavior and habits can have an effect on the child's growth and mental status. During the early stages of my Masterworks, I attended a conference and learned about a man who lived through a Canadian residential school. He is still affected by it today. First, he was taken away by the Canadian residential school officials. He did not get to say goodbye to his family. Then, while he was there, he learned that when he spoke his language, he would be sent to the recreation room where he would be whipped. He saw this happen to many young children who, because they are so young, did not know about the consequences they would face. After showers, the nuns would check if you were still dirty. He was called a filthy little Indian boy. If any of the children missed a spot, the nuns would scrub until the child bled. He then told us a story about a boy who slept on the bunk beside him. He wet the bed. Every time he wet the bed, he would get the strap 25 times. One day, the little boy was in the washroom during inspection. So he took his place, and he got the strap 25 times. Once he went to the bathroom with the little boy, and he saw that he was peeing blood. The man then told us another story about a prefect. This prefect for the Roman Catholic school was trusted by the families of the boys, and the prefect was supposed to take care of the group. This prefect did the opposite. He molested most of the boys in the section he was supposed to look after. School is supposed to prepare you for the world, get you ready for what's out there. The school did exactly the opposite. The school was a place of terror, trauma, and genocidal acts. The man who told the story was filled with anger and hate. He tried to dull this pain with alcohol. He had a friend who went through the school with him. He also turned to alcohol and drugs to dull the pain. They told us that they are still trying to heal, and they only started healing about 5 years ago. They are both 65 years old, and their time in the residential schools ended when they were both 18. He says, "It stays with you, and it never goes away." These two men are examples of lasting trauma and the effect of cultural genocide. It is not a thing you forget. It is not a thing that goes away from the ones who experience it. Now, it's the lasting event. Now, I would like to share a couple of clips from a documentary about him and his experiences.
Become a professional in shame. many times in my heart, because of what happened to me, I feel like I'm dangerous because of what I can go and do out into society and blame them for what they've done to me. I was robbed of a whole life. I'm now 65 years old, and this shit is still up here. It's very hard to deal with. To come to a forgiveness to these people. For me, it won't happen. Forgiveness.
These things that happen to us as children could never be undone. You could never find that happiness as a child again. My name is Joseph Michael Ginger. My First Nations name, or my family name, is Hia Krishna, which means lightning snake. I'm from Hochipasa, a group called the Channel tribes, which are a total of 14 tribes. Hochipasa happens to be one of them. I did a total of 12 years in 8 years in Christian Indian Residential School and 4 years in Mission Indian Residential School. I graduated in 1967.
My healing didn't start until like 4 years ago to deal with that stuff that I hid. I buried with drugs, alcohol, you name it, anything I could find, over the counter, under the counter, on the street.
There was a man that was a prefect for the Roman Catholic Church, worked for the federal government, that all of our parents, all of our ancestors, our relatives, trusted this man was a pedophile. He came to my bed many, many times and sexually molested me here in this school, on these trusted grounds. This is supposed to be a Catholic system to prepare me for life when I leave. It did exactly the opposite. When I left these grounds in grade 12, I was completely filled with hate, anger, shame, fear, disgust. I could not even go home and be close to my mother anymore. I could not hold my sisters with the love that I was supposed to give them. The anger that I have for this man will last in my body until the day I die.
After the Second World War, it was promised that there would be no more genocide. Killing founded in ethnic prejudice would end hate, would just stop. That did not happen. After the Holocaust, we had a few years of relaxation, not too many big mass murders. The Cold War, you could say, distracted people from thinking about killing or ethnically cleansing. Then, in 1975, the Cambodian genocide happened. Then, only 15 years later, the Rwandan genocide. Then, only 5 years after Rwanda, Bosnia happened. And then, 7 years later, Darfur. 4 high-profile genocides in almost rapid succession. How did this happen? Well, all humans aren't one single-celled organism. We have different opinions and views. One person is always going to disagree with another. One or many are still going to be prejudiced towards others. If we have so many disagreements, how do we all join together to stop genocide? Many people have hoped that on a united front, we can theoretically end this constant cycle of mass murder. But from what I've learned from others, and at a practical standpoint, we can't end genocide. You could try to sum up a situation where everyone can live in harmony, and it will all be happiness and rainbows. People may think that we have harmony and understanding today. We have had great attempts at reconciliation and repayment. The truth The creation of Israel, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the United Nations are all examples of reconciliation and repayment. But in reality, however, there are so many examples of widespread prejudice today. The word Jew is still used as an insult. Donald Trump, an American Republican presidential candidate, can be seen as the modern Hitler. There are still missing and murdered Aboriginal women. There are still reserves. There's the mental effects of residential schools and the intergenerational effect. These are all examples that illustrate that we are far from harmony and understanding today. In my opinion, and that of others, they really can't stop happening because we're humans, we're greedy. I believe that there is always the alpha-beta situation. Who's better? Who's stronger? The weaker or lesser are a burden, right? To live peacefully, we must have to get rid of the burden. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about me and my family history. So, why do I care? When you're interested in something, you want to learn more, right? That's how I feel about my topic, but it's very personal for me because it intertwines into my recent ancestry. I find, personally, that a lot of younger people do not know what the word genocide means. When I was younger, I read many stories of children who survived or experienced or hid from the camps. Some lost only a few family members, some lost all. In my case, 13 of my immediate family members died in Auschwitz-Birkenau and Sobibor. I have read a lot of sad books about genocide, death, and suffering, even before I started my research for this project. I think the first time I got a book like this was in grade 4. It was about a young girl who survived the Holocaust, but she lost her family in the process. I have read many books to this day about this subject. My dad always said, it doesn't make you happy to read the stories about people's struggles, but I disagree. Learning about these events can give you the knowledge to subdue, prevent, and know about future genocide or the extermination of a religion, or culture. Before I started my Masterworks, I had not read much about my Indigenous ancestry. When I started this project, I realized that this part of me is also very interesting to study. I did not really know that this part of me existed. To be completely honest, I'm kind of ashamed about not knowing as much as I should in comparison to my previous knowledge of my European history. I realize now that this is also a big part of my heritage, and this side of my family has also experienced genocide and discrimination. My grandpa always had a little more difficulty than usual when he was looking for work. It wasn't because he was underqualified, it was because of his looks. He was a little taller, he had a stronger brow, and slightly darker skin. In my personal opinion, he has a very friendly face, so why did people treat him this way? Residential schools were still in existence until the late 20th century. The last one closed in 1996. Many people treat him differently than they would treat whites. A while ago, I went to my grandpa's house. I was looking at some photos of my grandpa after his cancer surgery. He had lost a significant amount of weight because he could not consume enough food. His bone structure was showing through a lot more. When I saw that picture, I almost had an epic realization that I am part First Nation. I guess you could say it filled me with a sense of pride, because my grandpa is a very strong man. He endured discrimination, cancer, and a lack of wealth for most of his life. I guess this realization made a connection, and I now feel equal parts Dutch Jewish and Sanzar Lakota. My Oma, Mariana Johanna Vlessing, was born in 1931 in Alkmaar on April the 11th. She was the oldest of 3 siblings. Her father was born into an Orthodox Jewish family. Growing up, my Oma did not practice Judaism, though the whole family was still considered Jewish because of their religious history. When the Nazi Party began to attempt to occupy most of Western Europe, many Jewish people were afraid because the stories about death camps in the East were particularly harrowing and frightening. My Oma was not really afraid because she did not consider herself Jewish, but anyone with Jewish blood, regardless of their practice habits, were still sent on trains to the East. Many Vlessing family members were sent to the camps and eventually murdered. Identity cards of Jewish people were stamped with a large J. If you had the J on your card, you were sent away. This was how Nazis identified and kept track of the Jewish people. My Grootopa, or Elise Vlessing, had to go into hiding for 3 years to avoid being sent to a death camp. During the time he hid, my Oma and her siblings had no idea where he was. My Oma also had to hide temporarily. I would now like to share a quick voice memo about one of my Oma's many stories from her hiding experience.
Yeah, for me it changed well during the Second World War, when I was hidden, and I went to school in that village where I was. After school, we went as a group of girls together to one of the houses of the girls to ask for a sweet or whatsoever. And then they said to me, you have to wait outside. And they all went in. And I had to wait outside. And I didn't understand why, but that's what they said. So I had always had the feeling, I can wait outside. Yeah.
So, now that you've heard this voice memo, I would like you all to imagine yourself in my Alma's place. You are a young, non-practicing Jewish girl. You go to one of your girlfriend's houses. All your friends are not Jewish. Everybody is excited and giddy about spending time with their friends and getting special treats. Treats were difficult to come by because during the war, Holland was heading towards a famine. When you get to your friend's house, your parents ask for her to stay outside. They say, we hebben het liever dat het niet meer komt, which translates to, you can't come inside, or next time, don't come to our house, you're not allowed here. Still imagining yourself in this situation, how would you feel about not being told to enter your friend's house? Okay. 3 years eventually passed and Groot Opa got to go home. The majority of the Vlessing family members were dead. The Jewish population of Europe had largely decreased to 2/3 of its original population. There are also estimations for the number of non-Jews killed because they helped Jewish people hide. Homosexuals, Roma, Sintis, Soviet prisoners of war, people of color, and many other people were also killed during the Holocaust. Spotted Eagle first appeared on census records circa 1886. He was the headman of the Sanzark, a Lakota subtribe. The Sioux are divided into many separate subtribes. They all convene and meet at times during the year. They share the same beliefs, government systems, ways of life, travel patterns, and rituals. Spotted Eagle's daughter Linny married my great-grandfather, Robert McKay. They eventually had a son named Lloyd, who was the father of my grandpa. My grandpa was born on the 23rd of October, 1934. He was often seen as intimidating or scary. He was a 6-foot-tall, 250-pound native who was strong from years of working on the farm. Back then, many people did not often approach or talk to him because they were afraid, because the residential school mindset was still in existence. I can tell you now that my grandpa is a very nice man, brave man. He only chooses to be intimidating when the kids are being unruly. It was often very difficult for him to find work and keep a family of 6 children and an ailing wife afloat. The farm work was difficult. He woke up at 5 every morning to feed the chickens and cows, and he tended the fields for most of his life. Okay. There are really never many positive effects that are born at the end of a genocide, unless you count the advantage of having more room, resources, and precious items that aren't rightfully yours. However, this is at the cost of millions of lives. It's really too much to ask. The 20th century has been coined the age of genocide, not a very joyful reflection of a century that many consider a pride to the human race. We have become very technologically advanced, smarter, and also dumber at the same time. We often hear about the struggles of survivors, and we often do nothing about it. Is this caused by a want to block out our species' crimes? I would even argue that there are no good effects. Every country that is affected by genocide is left in shambles, and it takes a very generous amount of time, aid, and effort to get them back on their feet again. Only a small number of people can actually benefit from mass killing. People who disappear, or those who confess, or people who bribe their way out of trial with the things they stole. So often after a genocide, there is attempted or forced repayment. It is most often forced, because the perpetrating nation is still in the 8th stage, denial. After they repay their crimes, they still have a difficult relationship with the severely oppressed. After all, it's hard to repair burned bridges. Relationships are destroyed, blames are placed, bitterness, anger, and post-traumatic stress disorder can occur. There is also the loss of culture, pride, and direction, and this can lead to humiliation and further conflict. The amount of negative effects should really be taken into consideration when a group is planning a massacre or genocide. So, why do genocides keep happening? It's almost as if someone is just slowly, over time, choosing nations to experience their own genocide. Or does the effect of one genocide lead to another because of the bad things that happened before it? The UN's creation after World War II and the Holocaust was an attempt to rid the world of genocide, large conflict, and to create international cooperation. 4 genocides and many more wars did happen, but the UN is succeeding with helping victims and sending in prevention early. In my opinion, we've gone the last 13 years without a genocide, but if you look at the past genocides and look at the average between years, we were due for another about a year and 9 months ago. I believe that the horror of genocide should be a lesson to people to make sure it doesn't happen again. This would be the only effect I wish would be effective. To prevent a genocide, you often have to catch it early. We now have a much earlier response to tension. We send peacekeepers into nations experiencing conflict and tension as a way to find, understand, and fix the problem. Prevention is difficult when there are not a lot of people aware. So being informed and informative is also a necessary part of prevention. With more help, we can maybe even stop genocide. All that is needed is a worldwide energy to fuel the need for change and peace. I believe there are also a couple of steps similar to the stages that deal with prevention. The first step would be recognition, recognizing a brewing conflict or hazardous interaction. An example would be sensing a fistfight before it happens. The second step would be action. Already having recognized the situation, action is now taken to understand and stop or stall the conflict. An example would be stopping the force physically or getting help. The third step would be resolution. Already having taken physical action, communication is prompted to resolve the conflict or problem. An example would be talking it out and using words instead of fists, essentially finding the problem and diagnosing it. The fourth step would be acceptance, accepting that the problem has been solved and not reintroducing the conflict because of bad reason. Example would be resisting a possible want to return to blows. These steps are similar to the 8 stages of genocide, except they do the opposite. They attempt to outline the prevention process and show what it takes to prevent a genocide. The definition of reconciliation is the act of causing 2 people or groups to become friendly again after an argument or disagreement, or the process of finding a way to make 2 different ideas, facts, exist or be true at the same time. I would like to believe that the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians and Americans is coming close to full reconciliation. We have just made a huge step in Canada. The Supreme Court has recently stated that the Métis and non-status Indians have equal rights to status Indians. These rights as Indigenous people, their rights as Indigenous peoples were finally recognized. This is part of a huge step in reconciliation, the recognition of crimes of oppression on a very large scale. Also, the remembrance of these crimes are important, so we never forget what we did. The remembrance is to make sure these atrocities are never repeated. That is why we celebrate Remembrance Day, to say thanks to the people who protected us, and to remember the ones that were victims of war and genocide. The education of our history is also a significant part in recovery because it encourages children to help prevent, understand history, and to understand the importance of learning our lesson. Museums are often built to educate people on the events of history. I visited the Joodse Historisch Museum in Amsterdam to learn more about the history of Jews in Holland and the effect of World War II. There are many more museums about the histories of Aboriginal and Jewish people. They help people recognize and learn. I believe that the communications between Jews and Germans is now civil but definitely still strained. There are still significant amounts of prejudice, caution, and discomfort. Although the events committed are of the past, they have not necessarily been forgiven, but many people have moved on. Some have yet to, and they are still bitter for good reason. The deaths of Jews are still widely remembered around the world today. Wreaths are often placed down at the cenotaph to remember the lives lost. This is a major part in the acceptance and recovery. A day of remembrance of crimes committed against Indigenous peoples is, from my knowledge, not familiar to Canadians. I am not personally aware of anything closer resembling a Remembrance Day. Perhaps we are not to the stage of having a special day to remember. I believe that the day the ruling was confirmed would be a proper one. I would not like to think we are still in a widespread stage of denial, but hopefully it will eventually fade. In conclusion, I would like to readdress the importance of understanding and being informed. The importance of this topic is hopefully recognized and leaving people wanting to stand up, prevent, and heal. Looking back at the stories I have told and the causes I have shared, I would like to make my point clear that I do not believe genocides are over or finished. We in due time will probably experience another. Hopefully not one of horrific scale, hopefully one that can be prevented in its early stages. I would like to thank all my advisors for helping me with this hard thing. And last but not least, I would like to thank my family, specifically my parents, for helping me continue with this topic. And I would like to thank you all for watching.
On behalf of Island Pacific School, it's a pleasure for me to announce that Miss Julia Van Walraven has now completed all the requirements of her master's.